Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. How are we today? Feeling good? That's the spirit. Now, in our previous lecture, we introduced concepts of utility, marginal utility, the law of diminishing marginal utility, the equimarginal principle, how optimal quantities of one good and how optimal bundles of more than one goods were decided upon by rational consumers. Today we will talk a little bit more about what marginal utility means, and then we'll see how consumption decisions are made under uncertainty. And if we get time, we'll talk a little bit about the other approach to consumption analysis, that is the indifference curve approach. Now, if you remember, there was a small thing that I mentioned in the previous lecture, which some of you might still remember, and which is quite important actually. And that was that when you draw the marginal utility curve in price quantity space, and when we did this in the context of consumer surplus analysis, we saw that the marginal utility curve was actually equal to the demand curve, and that the different points on the curve, that is on the curve relating price to quantity, gave the different points or the different levels at which marginal utility equaled price, and the optimal quantities that a particular consumer will consume of a particular good at different prices. Now, the point that we made there was the relationship between the demand for a good and its marginal utility. Now, let's develop that a little bit further by putting the question as to what the market value of any good really is. What is the intrinsic market value of a good? And some of you might say, well, the market value of a good is simply the value or the price that the market puts on it. And that is simply the point where the demand and the supply curves intersect. That is, the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. Pretty obvious, isn't it? However, economists have puzzled long and hard about this question of what the true market value of a good should be or is. Some economists have focused on the demand side, and we will come to marginal utility in a short while, establishing that link. Some have talked more about the supply side, and together they have tried to understand what the deeper meaning of the value of a good is. And this is where the real or intuition about marginal utility comes in, is in its ability to explain the value, the intrinsic value of goods. Let's talk a little bit about this. Now, economists like Ricardo and Karl Marx were obsessed with the supply side of the economy. So, in their opinion, any good, any product, any commodity which was produced, its value was equal to the labor content, the value of labor content that had gone into the production of that good. So, if you take the example of bicycles, then the amount of labor hours and the equivalent price in terms of the wage rate paid for that amount would determine the value of those bicycles. So, if workers worked, let's say 20 days, working 8 hours a day and were paid at 20 rupees per hour, then if you multiply all of those, that would then combined give you the value of that bicycle. So, it's the labor content. Note that this labor content could be both direct and indirect. So, direct labor content would be workers actually working on the bicycle, screwing its parts together, polishing it, putting its wheels together, things like that. Whereas indirect labor content would be the labor content that has gone into the production of raw materials used in the production of bicycles. So, if steel is used to build the various parts of bicycles, then the labor content that went into the production of that quantity of steel would also be embedded in the total value of the bicycle. So, that was the supply side understanding or view on what the market value or the intrinsic value of any good or product would be. When economists started thinking about the demand side, economists like Adam Smith, they came across a puzzle, a paradox. And I'll give you an example of what that paradox consisted in. They found that when you looked at goods like water and diamonds, they were very different in terms of the value that they offered to different people. You know, water is something that is extremely useful and vital for human life. And while its utility might vary from individual to individual, almost all of us need water and recognize its importance for our existence. Diamonds, on the other hand, do not have that central contribution to make to our existence. Yet, when you compare the values of these two goods in the market, water sells for very cheap, and diamonds, even 1 carat of diamonds, sells for much more or many times the price of even a barrel or many barrels of water. And that particular question puzzled economists as to why it was the case that something which did not seem to have an intrinsic value, something like diamonds, would have such high value in the market. Now, that particular question about water and diamonds, believe it or not, was asked in the 1760s. And the answer to that question, believe it or not, came 100 years later, 120 years later actually, in the 1870s, when 3 European economists came together and launched the marginal utility revolution. And they said that they had the answer to this question in the concept of marginal utility. The argument that they put forward was that as we consume more and more of a particular good, its marginal utility falls. The fact that we consume a lot of water throughout the day and definitely throughout the year, the marginal utility of water, of an extra liter of water, is very low for us. Whereas if you compare it with diamonds, the marginal utility of an extra carat of diamonds remains very high because we are using such little quantity of diamonds throughout the year or throughout our lifetimes. So through the law of diminishing marginal utility, they said that water or any quantity which is consumed in very large quantities will have a low marginal utility. And since price is related to the marginal, not total utility of a product, then the price of that product or that commodity will be low. Whereas something which might have very low total utility, something like diamonds, could have very high marginal utility because it is used or consumed in very low quantities, and because the market prices anything according to its marginal utility, the price of that product, like diamonds, will be very high. Now, this can also be illustrated graphically, and let's go to a slide to see that. Now, as you can see in this graph, we've plotted the marginal utility curves, hypothetical curves for diamond, and the hypothetical marginal utility curve for water. So on the horizontal axis, we have liters per year, that is liters of water consumed per year, or the equivalent of that in diamonds would be carats of diamonds consumed or won or purchased during the year. On the vertical axis, of course, we have price. Now, as you can see, the marginal utility curve for diamonds is to the left of the marginal utility curve for water, and therefore the total utility of water is higher than the total utility of diamonds at any quantity and at any price. So at any point on these lines, the total utility of water, which is the area under the marginal utility curve, the total utility of water is unambiguously greater than the total utility of diamonds. On the other hand, if you look at the graph, you'll see that the price of water will be very low, because the quantity, the liters of water that we consume will be close to 2,000 or 3,000 liters a year, if not more. And therefore, the price that would obtain would be extremely low, very close to zero. On the other hand, the quantity of diamonds that we would probably consume would be 1 or even less than 1 during the year, and therefore the price of diamonds would be very close to the point of intersection of the marginal utility curve for diamonds and the price axis. So PD will be very close to that point of intersection, whereas PW will be very close to 0. Note that if a new technique was discovered of producing diamonds cheaply from coal, then their market value would fall rapidly, because then consumers would be able to consume more diamonds because of their greater availability, and then the price of diamonds would fall consequently. So, that was the way in which economists resolved the puzzle that existed on the demand side of the determination of the market value of any good. What happened on the supply side? Well, the supply side was always going to be obvious. Water is abundant, it's plentiful, and as you know, anything that is abundant or plentiful has a low value, whereas anything which is scarce has a high value. So in areas where water is scarce, it can have very high value, and one can take the example of countries where there are deserts and water is scarce. So Saudi Arabia or the Sahara, in those places water has very high value. Now, let's move to the second part of today's lecture, which is introducing uncertainty and risk into consumption decision analysis. Up till now, we've assumed that when a consumer makes a decision about what to consume and what to purchase, he knows exactly what his costs are going to be, and he knows exactly what gain or benefit he will derive from buying that particular good or consuming that particular good. So there is no uncertainty explicitly incorporated in the analysis so far. This might be true for some goods. So think of a bar of chocolate. So when you buy a bar of chocolate, you pay, let's say, 20 rupees for it. You know that it will be nice and sweet and crunchy, and that it will be finished in 2 minutes, and so that's the cost, the rupees 20 that you pay for it, and that's the benefit, right? But in order to look at durable goods and the consumption of durable goods, you need to introduce the concept of risk and uncertainty, and how people's attitude towards risk can affect their consumption decisions. So when you have the question of purchasing, let's say, a washing machine. Now this is a durable good, and remember we gave the example earlier on as well. So you have the decision to buy a washing machine before you. The washing machine costs 4,000, and the benefits are going to accrue in the form of easier washing of clothes over a number of years, or over the life of the washing machine, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Now, a consumer can make his decision based simply on the 4,000 and the benefits that will accrue to him. But look at the complications that can now happen. Imagine that 6 months after the purchase of the washing machine, it breaks down. Develops some fault, which can be corrected, of course, but it costs an additional 1,000 rupees. So that's the uncertainty on the cost side. Your total costs on the washing machine are not 4,000. They are now 4,000 plus 1,000, albeit this 1,000 has been incurred sometime after the initial purchase. So there could be uncertainty on the cost side, and the consumer is not aware of this at the time of purchasing the washing machine. He is aware that there is uncertainty, but he is not aware what price or what additional costs he might incur further down the road. There could be uncertainty on the benefit side as well. So when you think that you bring the washing machine home, it will wash so many clothes in so many hours and then dry them up, if it has a dryer, in, let's say, half an hour or 1 hour after each wash. But when you actually bring the washing machine home, you discover that there are problems with its dryer, that it dries only in 2 hours, and that it consumes far greater electricity, and that its washing quality is not very good, or that its door doesn't close properly, and all sorts of problems which reduce its benefit. Now, these problems could have been anticipated at the time of buying, but they could not surely be accurately predicted. No one could predict that this would happen with this washing machine so many months down the road. So that's the uncertainty part of this decision to buy a durable good. Now, that problem illustrates that the problem of uncertainty is integral to our consumption decisions, especially when we talk about durables. But how do we resolve this problem? How do consumers respond to uncertainty? The answer to that is that it depends on whether they are risk averse, whether they love risk, or whether they are risk neutral. And we'll define these terms shortly. But the basic answer is that it depends on their attitude towards risk and risk taking. Note the distinction between uncertainty and risk. Attitudes to risk and the discussion of attitude to risk makes sense once the problem of uncertainty has been resolved to the extent that you are certain about the uncertainty. Oof, that's confusing, huh? Let me illustrate through a couple of examples. Imagine that you sit an exam. Let's say you sit the economics exam, the introductory economics course that I am giving, and that you do fairly well, but that you're not sure whether you have scored a distinction or that you've just passed, right? Now, if you can put probabilities on whether you will score a distinction or whether you will pass, you've resolved the uncertainty problem to some extent. So that you know that you're not sure, not 100% sure what your marks will be, whether they will be 75 or 55, or whether they'll be 65 or 75. But that you have assigned probabilities, likelihood values to what marks you could get. So let's say you say that you have a 60% chance that you will score above 80, and that you have a 40% chance that you score below 80. Now, to that extent, you've solved the uncertainty problem in that you have developed certain probabilities about that uncertainty. Now, how does risk come into that? The attitude to risk comes in once you have set these probabilities. Now, if you think that 60% is a high probability or 40% is a low probability, that could determine whether you want to celebrate after the exam and not study too much about your next exam, or whether you want to work harder on your other exams because you feel that you've not done too well on your economics exam. Now, let's develop this distinction further through our example, the washing machine example that we gave earlier. Now, in that example, imagine that you have a clear idea of the probability that the washing machine will be a good buy after you've bought it, and the probability that it will be a bad buy. By good buy, I mean that it will work well and function well throughout its life, and that its life is 10 to 15 years. And by bad buy, I mean that the washing machine will develop faults after 6 months or 1 year, and will cause additional costs, and that its benefits will be not as great as originally imagined. Now, let's say you give the same probabilities, let's say 60% probability to the chance of the washing machine being good, and 40% to the chance that it is bad. So once you've developed those probabilities, the question now arises as to whether you will buy that washing machine or not buy that washing machine. Now, a simple answer that you might give is that you will buy the washing machine. Why? Because the probability that it will be a good washing machine and it will prove beneficial to you is greater than the probability that it will be a bad buy. The answer to that question is not so simple. The answer involves understanding consumers' attitudes to risk. So we need to define 3 different types of risk attitudes that consumers can have. One is risk averse, one is risk neutral, and one is risk loving. Now, what do these terms mean? In order to develop an understanding of that, we need to define what is called the odds ratio. Now, the odds ratio is simply the ratio of the probability of success and the probability of failure. So it's the probability of success or the machine being good divided by the probability of failure, that is the machine being bad. In the example given, the probability of success was 60% and the probability of failure was 40%. So the odds ratio would be 1.5, 0.6 divided by 0.4. Now consider if the probabilities are even, that is, you have 50% chance that the machine will do well and 50% chance that it will break down and not do so well. Now, what will a consumer do and respond to this odds ratio? Now, in order to understand that, let's now see the 3 types of odds ratios that we can have. You can either have an odds ratio that is equal to 1, that is when the 2 probabilities are equal, which is this case, 50-50. You could have the first example in which the odds ratio is greater than 1, that was 1.5, so that was 60-40. And you could also have a case where the odds ratio is less than 1. So you could have the probability of the machine being bad at 70% and the probability of the machine being good at 30%, and then you'd have the odds ratio equal to 3/7. Now, if the odds ratio is equal to 1, we say that there are fair odds, FAIR. If the odds ratio is less than 1, we say that the odds are unfavorable. And if the odds ratio is greater than 1, then we say that the odds are favorable. Now, a risk neutral consumer is one who consumes or who makes the decision to purchase the washing machine when the odds ratio is greater than 1. He is indifferent when the odds ratio is 1. So he is indifferent between buying the machine and not buying the machine. He can't choose between the two when the odds ratio is 1. And he will not buy the machine when the odds ratio is less than 1. Now look at what a risk-averse consumer would do. A risk-averse consumer will not buy the machine if the odds ratio is less than 1. So same as the risk-neutral consumer. But he will also not buy the machine if the odds are equal to 1. So he will not buy the machine if the probability of the machine being good versus machine being bad was 50-50. He would not buy. He would prefer to save his money. He might even decide not to buy the machine if the odds ratio was greater than 1. So if the odds ratio was, let's say, 1.2 or 1.1, he might still feel that there is too much uncertainty involved for him to take the plunge or take the risk. Compare this with a risk-loving consumer. A risk-loving consumer can buy the machine when the odds ratio is greater than 1. He can buy the machine when the odds ratio is equal to 1. And he can also buy the machine when the odds ratio is less than 1. Now, you must be wondering what kind of people it is who take decisions or buy goods when the probability of the good turning out to be bad is greater than the probability that the good will prove to be good. Well, there are people like that. Look at gamblers who gamble on very small chances, or when events are unlikely to happen, they often gamble on that, and then sometimes they are proved right and sometimes they are proved wrong. So some people who are risk-loving, who take a lot of risks, who are used to gambling, they can fall into the category of risk-lovers. But there is no doubt that most of the average consumers, like yourselves and myself would fall into the category of risk-averse consumers who would like to avoid uncertainty where they can. So they would not buy the washing machine if they have odds ratios like 1 or less than 1. Now, let's try to understand why this is the way it is. Why are most consumers risk-averse? And let's illustrate this through the use of an example. When you say that a consumer is risk-averse, what you're basically saying is that the benefit that he derives from an additional rupees 100 is less than the loss or suffering that he would feel at losing an equivalent rupees 100. Do you understand that? So the gain, let's say, from an additional rupees 100 that he gets is less than the loss or suffering or pain that he feels when he loses rupees 100. So think of a game that you play. You play a game in which you can win 100, and there's a 50% chance of that happening. And you can lose 100, and there's a 50% chance of that happening, right? So you can toss a coin, and if you have heads, you are given 100 rupees, and if it's tails, you pay 100 rupees. Will you play this game? A risk-averse consumer will not play this game because the gain of that additional 100 is less than the feeling of loss that he feels or senses at losing the 100. Why is it the way it is? Because adjusting your lifestyle upwards with the new money that you've got is easier than adjusting your lifestyle downwards. So for example, if you own a motorbike and you get 1 lakh rupees and now you're able to buy a car, that's easy for you. You will be happy about that. But if you lose 1 lakh rupees and then you are downgraded to a bicycle or to walking, then it will be difficult and much more difficult for you to adjust to this new lifestyle. So upgrades in lifestyle are easier than downgrades, and this is normal human behavior. Nothing special about that. Now, consolidating the implication of the previous example, we can say that if we are offered to play a game in which we win 1 lakh rupees and there's a 50% chance of that, and we lose 1 lakh rupees and there's a 50% chance of that, we will not play that game. And the underlying reason for that is that when you win the 1 lakh rupees, maybe you derive 10 satisfaction units, but when you lose 1 lakh rupees, you will lose 20 satisfaction units, and in absolute terms, therefore, the magnitude of loss is greater than the magnitude of the gain. Now, this discussion here also helps us understand the concept of diminishing marginal utility of income. Let's talk a little bit about this concept. Now, we've talked about the diminishing marginal utility of an individual good, so that when you consume more and more of one good, the marginal utility that you derive from each additional good falls as you increase your consumption. But this also applies to a consumer's overall consumption. That is, as your total consumption increases. So if you're consuming rupees 1 lakh per year, right? And if you increase that to rupees 1,20,000 and then to 1,40,000, then the increment of that 20,000, the first 20,000, the increment to your utility will be greater than the increment that the second 20,000 addition makes. So the marginal utility and the diminishing nature of that extends to the case when we are discussing total or aggregate consumption of an individual. Now let's illustrate this through a simple example. When you give 1 rupee to a beggar on the street, somebody who is in rags, who hasn't had food, that 1 rupee means a lot to him. It has a lot of value for him, right? But if you give 1 rupee, or if a person who is already a millionaire, businessman, If he earns 1 more rupee in profit, that 1 rupee is worth nothing for him. And this is exactly the concept of diminishing marginal utility of income. The amount in question is the same, 1 rupee, but it means a lot to the beggar, but it means very little to the businessman. Why? Because the 1 rupee is a major part, is a high proportion of the beggar's total income or assets, but it is a very tiny proportion of the wealthier person or the rich person's total income or wealth. Now let's develop this concept of diminishing marginal utility further, and let's illustrate how uncertainty comes into this. Let's first go to a slide which will draw the total utility curve for an individual, and then see how we can bring in the concept of diminishing marginal utility of income. Let's go to our slide. Now this is a graph of utility, total utility versus income for a hypothetical consumer. Let's say it's you. The figure here merely shows the total utility that you get from your income, and you have different levels of income shown here. The slope of the curve gives the marginal utility of your income, just as it did in the case of when we were drawing in utility versus goods space. Now, as the marginal utility of income diminishes, the curve gets flatter. A rise in income from rupees 5,000 to rupees 10,000, for example, will cause a movement along the curve from point A to point B. Total utility will rise from U1 to U2. A similar rise in income from rupees 10,000 to rupees 15,000, however, will lead to a move from point B to point C, and hence a smaller rise in total utility from U2 to U3. Now assume that your income is rupees 10,000 and that you are offered a chance to play that 50-50 game worth rupees 5,000. That is, you lose 5,000 with a 50% probability and you gain 5,000 with a 50% probability. So effectively, you have an equal chance of your income rising to rupees 15,000 or falling to rupees 15,000. Now, at an income of rupees 10,000, your total utility is U2. If you take the risk and you are lucky and that you win and your gamble pays off, your income will rise to rupees 15,000 and your total utility will go to, yes, U3. However, if your gamble does not pay off, that is, you are unlucky and you lose the game, you will be left with only rupees 5,000 and a utility of U1. Given that you have a 50-50 chance of winning, your average or mean expected utility will be midway between U1 and U3. That is U1 plus U3 over 2, or in this case shown as U4. But this is the utility that would be gained from an income of rupees 8,000. Given that you would prefer U2 to U4, you will therefore choose not to play the game. Thus, risk aversion is part of rational utility maximizing behavior. Now, some of you might be wondering how exactly or why exactly is this happening. Now, this happens due to the curvature of the total utility function. Now, the key implication of this curvature is that the average of the arc AC is point B. That is, for the horizontal axis, the average of 5,000 and 15,000 is 10,000. And this is the midpoint of the arc AC projected onto the horizontal axis. But importantly, B is not the average for the vertical axis. That will obtain at X. So if the arc AC is projected upon the vertical axis, you get the points U1 and U3, and the average of that is U4, which hits the curve at X. Now, think about what would happen if the total utility function were a straight line and not a concave function. That is, the consumer is risk neutral. In this case, y delivers the average for both the horizontal axis and the vertical axis. So, in that graph, we saw how the utility, the total utility function would look like for a risk-averse consumer and for a risk-neutral consumer. I will leave it to you to guess what the shape of the total utility function will be for the risk-loving consumer. Now, we've talked about risk and risk averseness, and that most of us will fall in the risk-averse category of consumers. Now, the question is there no solution for risk-averse consumers when they are faced with uncertainty? That is, if we do not like uncertainty generally, is there any way we can hedge against it? I mean, if the odds for buying a washing machine are 1 or less than 1, does that mean I will not buy the washing machine, right? Or nobody here will buy a washing machine? That doesn't usually happen, does it? And then we have to make more important or bigger decisions than buying a washing machine. People buy cars. People build houses. Imagine the risk in building a new house. What if the house burns down? Right? So there is a lot of risk involved. Now the way to get around that is through insurance. We can use risk hedging to ensure that the uncertainty or the impact of uncertainty on our lifestyles is minimized. Now, insurance as a risk hedging device is not very common in lower income countries, but it is very common and very well developed. The insurance industry is very well developed in higher income countries, in Europe, in America, in OECD economies. The way it works is as follows. If you build a house and the probability of the house burning down is 1%, then you might want to guard against that possible scenario or that possible eventuality by paying a premium, some money, to the insurance company. That money will be a small portion of the value of the house. Let's say that's 2% or something. And in case that your house does burn down, then the insurance company will reimburse you for the costs of rebuilding your house. Similar analogies exist for health insurance and car insurance. So in the case of car insurance, if you run into an accident, if you have an accident, then the insurance company will reimburse you for the costs of repairing your car or for the other car that you have accidented. Now, you must be wondering, how does the insurance company take this risk on itself and still operate profitably? I mean, surely if the house burns down, the insurance company will be required to reimburse for the full cost of the house, even though it's only received a small premium at the start of the period. How does it work? Well, the way it works is twofold. Insurance companies do not just collect the premium from you. They'll collect this premium from 100 people like you. Right? So if the probability of your house burning down is 1%, then the probability that in 100 houses, one house will burn, that's what the two are equal to. So if the insurance company insures 100 houses, of those 100 houses, on average, only one house will burn down. So it will receive the insurance premium from 100 houses and will need to reimburse just one house which has been burned. So this is how insurance companies operate. They also diversify across products. So they don't not only give insurance to a lot of people, but they give different types of insurance. So they will give car insurance, health insurance, house insurance, all life insurance, all different types of insurance, and that also helps diversify their risk. Now, maybe the picture I've presented for insurance companies is a bit too bright. I mean, it's not that simple for insurance companies either. Money making can sometimes become very tough. And the reason for that is that you have the problems of adverse selection and moral hazard. And though we will talk about these in detail when we come to information economics, let me briefly touch upon these two concepts here. Let's take the example of an insurance company which gives out health insurance. So it guards you against you falling ill. So if you fall ill, the insurance company will cover your medicine bills, your hospitalization bills. If you are being operated upon, it will cover your operation expenses. So how does the insurance company price this service of its? What it will do is it will charge a premium. It will assess what the average medical costs of a person are. Let's say it assesses them at 2,000 rupees annually. So that's the average medical costs a person incurs in a year. And then maybe the insurance company sets a premium of 2,500. This is the amount that a person will pay the insurance company if that person wants to guard him or herself against the risk of falling ill. So the 500 difference between 2,500 and 2,000 is the amount of money that the insurance company will make either to boost its profits or to cover its costs. Now there is an adverse selection problem that the insurance company might face, and that problem is as follows. When it announces its premium of 2,500, who are the people who will rush to the insurance company first to get insurance? Think about it. It will be the people who need health care most, or whose health expenses, health-related expenses are greater than 2,500, right? So old people, or people who are perennially ill, who suffer from some chronic diseases, or who are expected to undergo operations, right? So it's people like those who will rush to buy insurance, because in their estimates, their annual health expenditure will be in the range of, let's say, 5,000 or 6,000 rupees, and they will run away cheap because they only pay 2,500 to the insurance company. So this is the problem of adverse selection. So the insurance company needs to be selective about the people who are able to buy insurance from it. So it might have to do some kind of screening exercise, in that only those people are allowed to buy insurance who meet certain medical standards and who can be categorized as average consumers. On the other hand, insurance companies can face the moral hazard problem, and this is an ex post concept. Adverse selection was an ex ante problem, that is, it happened before people took out insurance. Moral hazard is something that happens after people take insurance. So imagine that you've bought a car, right, a new car, and that you are fond of driving. So you go to your insurance company and say that I want to insure my car against the risk of accident. So the insurance company will give you that insurance. Now once you have the safety of the insurance, you might be tempted to drive your car just that little bit faster, because you know that in the event of an accident, the insurance company will come to your rescue. Now, if you had not bought the insurance, if you had not got insurance cover for your car, you might not have driven faster. It is because you've taken insurance cover that your attitude, your actions, your behavior has changed. And this is called by economists moral hazard. So these two are the major problems that insurance companies face in giving out insurance, and sometimes they can be pretty serious. That, my friends, broadly concludes our discussion for today. If you remember, we started by developing the concept of marginal utility a little bit better. We saw how marginal utility was related to the intrinsic value of goods. We saw that when you look at the demand side of a good's value, then marginal utility analysis can help explain why essential goods like water can have very low price in the market, while goods like diamonds, which have very low utility or necessary element in that sense, can have very high prices in the market. Then we introduced risk and uncertainty into our analysis. We saw that in certain decisions, especially decisions on the consumption or purchase of durable items like washing machines, consumers might be faced with the problem of imperfect information about what might happen to that durable good over a longer period of time. So we gave the example of chocolate versus the washing machine, that with a bar of chocolate, you pay 20 rupees and you consume it in 2 minutes and it's nice and crunchy. But with a washing machine, you can develop faults 6 months down the lane. So there is uncertainty to costs. Similarly, there can be uncertainty to benefits. That is, the washing machine might not perform as well as you had expected it to. We also distinguished between risk and uncertainty. And we made that distinction in the context of probabilities. We saw that when you did not know the probabilities about certain things happening, that is, if you did not know what the probability of the washing machine being a good buy was, or the probability of the washing machine being a bad buy was, you were in the realm of uncertainty. But if you developed some understanding or a better assessment of how uncertain you were, that is, if you became a little bit more certain about your uncertainty, that is, you assigned specific probabilities to the washing machine turning out to be a good buy or the washing machine turning out to be a bad buy, you were then in the realm of risk. And there, attitudes to risk determined how consumers would respond to a particular distribution of probabilities. If you remember, we then defined the odds ratio as the ratio of the probability of success to the probability of failure, and then we said that fair odds was when this odds ratio was equal to 1, then favorable odds was when this ratio was greater than 1, and unfavorable odds was when this ratio was less than 1. And then we defined what risk-averse, risk-loving, and risk-neutral consumers were in the context of how they responded or how they made consumption decisions based on whether the odds were favorable, equal to 1, or unfavorable. Now, after that, we developed a concept of diminishing marginal utility of income. We noted that most consumers were risk-averse, and this had something to do with how they valued additional money or additional rupees given the level of expenditure or consumption that they were already at. And we gave the example of a single rupee and what it means to a beggar or a hungry person whose total income is very small, and what it means to a very rich businessman for whom that 1 rupee is trivial. So that was the concept of diminishing marginal utility of income. Then we also drew the total utility curve in the utility and income space, and we saw that that curve would be a concave curve, like in the previous analysis of total utility in the total utility versus good space. It would be a concave curve in the case of a risk-averse consumer. It would be a straight line in the case of a risk-neutral consumer, and I left it to you to decide what it would be in the case of a risk-loving consumer. Finally, we will discuss insurance, and I've already recapped on that, so no need to talk more on that. Let's now talk briefly about what we will be discussing in the next lecture. Now, our next lecture will be about indifference curve analysis. Now, I mentioned at the start of this lecture that there were 2 approaches to studying consumer behavior in economics. There was the marginal utility approach, and I gave the historical context and the conceptual context to that, and there was the indifference curves approach. And the major difference between these 2 approaches was that the marginal utility approach uses a cardinal approach to utility. That is, it assigns or it measures utility in cardinal or unit terms. So we used utils, remember, as an imaginary unit of utility. We also used satisfaction units, 10 or 20. And economists somehow have not been happy with this. They say it's very difficult to measure utility in terms of units. So alternatively, they came up with what is called the indifference curve approach. This is very interesting. It uses the ordinal approach in which different options are ranked in order of preference, but no explicit value is assigned to each ranking. So we'll build on that in our next lecture, and we will hopefully then be able to conclude our analysis of demand and consumption in the next 2 lectures. So my friends, I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. We will meet inshallah in the next lecture and build on the stuff that I've just mentioned, indifference curve analysis, and how that can improve further our understanding of demand and consumption. I hope you look at the questions I've put up on the web for you. They've been tailor-made to enhance your understanding and your intuition of economics. So go through them and develop a feel for these concepts like diminishing utility of income, diminishing marginal utility of income, or the odds ratio, favorable, fair and unfavorable odds, because you will be tested on these concepts later on. So go home. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. Do some of those practice questions, and we'll meet in our next lecture again. Till then, it is Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.